On Thursday, Vladimir Putin did something he has never done in 26 years in power. He set foot on the Kuril Islands, the Pacific chain the Soviet Union seized from Japan in the final days of World War II, and that Tokyo has been demanding back ever since. He toured a fish plant, a hospital, a school on the island Russia calls Iturup and Japan calls Itorafu. He shook hands with schoolchildren. On paper, it looks almost boring, a leader visiting a remote province. It is not boring. It is a deliberate provocation aimed at a country Russia has spent decades trying not to fully alienate. Here's why that matters. For over 70 years, this territorial dispute has been the single reason Russia and Japan have never signed a peace treaty formally ending World War II hostilities. 4 islands. 17,000 Japanese residents forced out when Soviet troops rolled in. A wound that never closed, held open on both sides for 3 generations. And every Russian leader, including Putin himself, has handled it the same way for decades. Putin once stood in Vladivostok and offered to sign a peace treaty with Japan, without any preconditions. He talked about the constructive relationships Moscow built with past Japanese leaders. This was a man managing a sensitive relationship, not torching it. Thursday, he torched it. Japan's response was immediate and unusually sharp. The foreign minister summoned Russia's ambassador and lodged what he called a strong protest, declaring the islands are Japan's territory, both historically and under international law. Japan's prime minister went further, calling the visit absolutely unacceptable and warning it had hardened Japanese public opinion toward Russia for years to come. Moscow's answer to all of that? Contempt. Former President Dmitry Medvedev, now a senior Kremlin security official, posted online that the islands were, are, and will remain Russian land, and warned that anyone who disagreed would face what he called monstrous consequences. That is not the language of a government trying to keep the peace. That's the language of a government picking a fight on purpose. So why now? Why would Putin spend political capital opening a new front with Japan, a G7 country, a U.S. treaty ally, a nation that's already sanctioned Russia hard since 2022, at the exact moment his war in Ukraine is stalling and his economy is under strain? One theory making the rounds among analysts is blunt: distraction. This visit landed just days after fresh reports surfaced about Russian territorial losses to Ukraine. Reports the Kremlin would very much like the domestic conversation to move past. A defiant flag planting on contested islands, framed as Russian strength, is a convenient way to change the subject from a war that isn't going well. It's the oldest trick in the authoritarian playbook. When you can't win the fight you're in, pick a new one you can win by simply showing up. And there's a second, colder logic underneath it. If Putin genuinely believes any peace settlement with the West is years away, then there is no longer a diplomatic reason to keep this dispute dormant. Better to bank a symbolic, cost-free win now, while relations with Tokyo are already as bad as they're going to get anyway. Either way, the message to Japan, and to every country watching, is the same one Cursed August keeps sending. This is a government that reaches for confrontation when it's cornered, not caution. Which brings us to the second story, because while Putin was needling Tokyo, Washington was quietly building the machine meant to squeeze him. For months, a bipartisan group in Congress has been assembling what supporters call a sledgehammer, a bill that would let the president slap tariffs of up to 100% on any country that keeps buying Russian oil and gas, or that helps Moscow dodge existing sanctions. The pitch is simple. Ordinary sanctions haven't changed Putin's behavior, so hit the money at the source. Squeeze the countries still funding the war machine by buying Russian energy, and squeeze them hard enough that it isn't worth it anymore. On the surface, this looks like exactly what Cursed August needs: real teeth. Rare bipartisan agreement in a Washington that agrees on almost nothing else. But look closer, and there's a catch buried in the fine print. The bill doesn't just hand the president a hammer, it hands him the only key that can put the hammer down. Under the legislation, the president can waive the tariffs whenever he decides it serves the national interest, or dial them up and down country by country, depending on how he personally judges their behavior toward Russian oil and gas. Which means the toughest sanctions package Congress has assembled against Russia in years comes with an off switch, and only one person holds it. That's not a small detail. That's the whole architecture of the bill. Think about what that actually means in practice. Congress can pass the sledgehammer. Congress can vote for it nearly unanimously. But whether it ever actually swings depends entirely on whether the man in the Oval Office feels like swinging it that week. If relations with Moscow warm up, say after a hostage release timed perfectly to flatter him, the tariffs can just not happen. No new vote required. No override needed. Just a quiet decision that today isn't the day. Critics looking at this bill make a simple point. Handing that much discretionary power to any single president, regardless of who he is a strange way to build a credible deterrent. A threat that can be switched off by one phone call isn't really a threat. It's a suggestion with paperwork. So here's where Cursed August lands this week, and it's a genuinely strange position for the Kremlin to be in. On one hand, Putin is picking a real fight with a G7 ally over a 70-year-old grudge, seemingly to paper over bad news from the front. On the other hand, the sharpest financial weapon the West has built against him in years turns out to have a built-in escape hatch, sitting in the hands of a president who released one of Putin's American hostages last week for nothing in return. Put those two stories side by side and you get the real picture of where things stand. Russia's economic position is weak enough that Congress felt it needed a 100% tariff sledgehammer to move the needle. Russia's military position in Ukraine is shaky enough that the Kremlin apparently needed a flag-planting exercise in the Pacific to change the conversation at home. And yet, the single biggest variable in whether any of this actually costs Moscow anything isn't Moscow's behavior at all. It's the mood of one man in Washington on any given week. That's not stability. That's not control. That's a government reaching for symbolism with one hand while an outside power holds the real lever with the other, and hoping nobody notices which hand actually matters. 3 decades of Augusts have taught the same lesson over and over. When the Kremlin runs out of good options, it doesn't sit still. It reaches for something loud, a coup, a war, a staged crisis. This week, a pair of disputed islands 6 miles off the coast of Japan. The question, as always, is what August still has left in the calendar. There are still more than 2 weeks to go. Cursed August isn't done yet. It never is.